On October 23, 2013, California State Assembly member from District 22, Kevin Mullen, and San Mateo County Supervisor Warren Slocum hosted the first annual Connect13 conference at YouTube headquarters in San Bruno, California. Strengthening communities through social media was the theme, bringing together social media experts and San Mateo County attendees from business, public, and government sectors to discuss the opportunities and challenges of using social media to communicate, collaborate, legislate, and participate. Peninsula Television is proud to bring you this conference, and all of the segments are available on YouTube and at www.pentv.tv/Connect13.
When we, months and months ago, maybe February, I don't exactly remember, started to line up the speakers for today's events, somebody in the county manager's office who recently retired, her name's Mary McMillan, came to me along with Marshall Wilson and said, you really, really, really need to get Charlene Lee, who's a San Mateo County resident, to come and do a keynote at your event. And nobody in the manager's office, nor I personally knew Charlene. Carol said, well, pick up the phone and call her and introduce yourself and tell her what you want. And so I called, I emailed, and begged, not really. But Charlene was very, very gracious. I want you to know that. She never hesitated. She said yes right away. And she was just awesome in that regard. She's, for those of you that don't know, the president of the Altimeter group, and she's one of the Peninsula's leading thinkers on civic engagement. And if you haven't bought her book, maybe she'll plug it later. I'll plug it for her. You can get the book on Amazon.com. It's called Open Leadership. And so please do take a look at that book. Some of the people in our office, the county manager's office, have actually read the book, and it got good reviews, Charlene. So Kevin is going to share a little bit more about Charlene's bio, but Charlene, let me just say that it was awfully good of you to say yes right away, and just we're just thrilled. Both Kevin and I and everybody here are thrilled that you're here. Thank you so much.
All right, I have the pleasure of giving a little bit of biographical background on Charlene. Charlene Lee is one of the foremost experts on social media and technologies, and a consultant and independent thought leader on leadership, strategy, social technologies, interactive media, and marketing. She founded the Altimeter Group, a group of 20 employees, mostly industry analysts, senior consultants, researchers, and operational staff, in June 2008. Their headquarters are in San Mateo. The Altimeter Group earned the distinction of being named one of the 5 most creative small businesses in 2010. They have over 100 active clients, with more than a third of them listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. What do? The company provides research and advice for companies challenged by business disruptions, enabling them to pursue new opportunities and business models. They share their independent research on business disruptions via research reports, webinars, speeches, and more. And they offer advisory services to business leaders who wish to explore the specific implications of these disruptions within their organizations. Charlene is a Harvard Business School grad, and she graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. In her free time, Charlene authored the New York Times bestseller, Open Leadership, which Warren referenced, and co-authored the critically acclaimed bestseller, Groundswell, named one of the best business books in 2008. She's married, a mom, loves puzzles, and is a self-professed geek, along with Warren and I. Please join me. We are so excited to have with us Charlene Lee.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'm the one who's very honored to be here because I do live and work in San Mateo County, in San Mateo itself. And so it's a real honor to be here to talk about one of my key passions, which is around how technologies can really make a difference in the way that we work, the way that we live and interact with each other. So when we talk about these technologies, what are we actually talking about? Well, we've got people like Facebook, we've got LinkedIn, Twitter, Google, YouTube. Let's put a whole list of them up there. And because of the diversity that we have here in the county, there are also quite a few international sites in here too as well. It's not just the sites that are here domestically in the United States. So how do you make sense of all of this? Because no matter what is out there today, there's going to be more that's coming down the pipe tomorrow. There are things like Pinterest, Snapchat. Pick another one that's out there. There's yet another one to learn, to master people, things that your constituents are using. So how do you make a strategy around this? How do you lead an organization when the landscape that you're trying to understand is constantly shifting underneath your feet? Well, let me give you an example. Let's go back in time to a particular situation that one company was dealing with, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things that were unknown. And this is all the way back in 2006. This is a Dell computer that was at an event like this in Kyoto, Japan. And it started smoking, and it finally caught into flames. Talk about a malfunction, right? So this is a laptop that's captured in film on a camera at that point, and started spinning around the blogosphere, and then started making its way into the traditional press. Now, this is back in 2006. Just to give you some perspective, there was no Twitter. Facebook was still only available to a small number of people. YouTube was quite popular at that time, but still hadn't reached the kind of reach that we have today. So this is a very different time, but Dell still had a very significant problem, you could say, a small one at that, because there was a significant malfunction of the product. So what do you do if you're Dell? Do you go out and forget about it, try to ignore it? Well, they couldn't, because just 2 weeks before this happened, they had just started their blog. And so they were posting things on there like, oh, look at our new servers, look at these new gaming laptops, look at these beautiful professional laptops. And the only thing people wanted to talk about was, well, nice laptop, is it going to blow up on my lap? So what do? Well, if you're the chief blogger at Dell, Latimer Chaka, what he did is he went directly to Michael Dell, the chairman of the company at the time, and he said, we need to talk about this. But how do I do it? I mean, no one's ever done this before. And he said, let's go back to our values. What do we stand for? What's the relationship we have with our customers? We've always been about being direct. So let's be direct about this. Go out there and do the right thing. Write about this. Tell people what's going on. Be transparent. Be authentic. So this is the post that he wrote. And it says, Flaming Notebook. That's the name of the post. And it says, beyond what you've seen in the blogosphere, we don't have an update on the now infamous Flaming Notebook from Osaka. And they link to that picture that you just saw. They link right to it. We'll give you an update as soon as we find out more. We think it's the batteries, but hang on. We'll tell you more what's happening. They went out and wrote a total of 12 different blog posts over the next couple of weeks, explaining, yes, it was the batteries, and yes, we're going to have to recall them, and this is the process. And they went back and talked to their customer call centers and worked with them so that people had more questions. They knew that they could go onto the blog and find out more information there. They answered every question that came at them on the blog, and they went out into the blogosphere, into forums, into wherever they could to answer questions that people had. Now, let me ask you this. If you had a situation like this, and I'm sure things like this happen all the time with the organization, if something went wrong, how many of you today, right now, would feel comfortable with you or a member of your staff writing a post like that? I would love to see a show of hands. How many? I got one, I got two. What does that say about us? This was in 2006. Fast forward 7 years now. All these technologies now, and we actually haven't gotten that far in terms of our ability to truly, truly deal with the power that these technologies give to us. You're going to hear a tremendous amount of fun, cool, neat technologies today. But I ask you this, fundamentally, how are you going to use those to change and enhance the relationship that you have with each other, with your staff, your team, and most importantly, your constituents, the people who you work for. Because in the end, social is not about the technologies, it's about the relationships you can form. And that's really hard. How many of us are in really easy to manage, perfectly flowing relationships? I would love to hear about them, because every relationship that I have been in that has been worth having has been hard fought. You have to invest in it. It takes time, and there are problems with them. So why would this be any different? Technology doesn't make it easier. Technology makes it possible, but the work still has to go into it. So I'm going to give you a couple quick frameworks, and then I'm going to dig into some things. This is our maturity cycle that we look at when companies are coming to us and saying, how do we think about where we are on the path? And companies will be on different levels of that path. You as an organization may be still at the very beginning. You're still trying to figure out what our presence we're going to have, how we're going to engage. Other organizations are far off onto the right-hand side now. They're already thinking beyond just becoming a social business. They're thinking already that it's just integrated, completely ingrained in everything that we do. But no matter where you are, you have to have a strategy and to think carefully about what the components of that are. I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but we do have some frameworks, and I'm happy to send you some of the papers around this. It is really about starting with your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? And very importantly, a very key part of this is the leadership that has to be there to guide and to lead that strategy. A strategy doesn't happen in of itself. It really needs you to be able to guide that. So I want to give you an example of one of the most interesting open leadership examples that I had. And it was actually not your sort of typical business, it was the military, actually. This is the aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz, and I had the honor of going on it in 2009 for about 24 hours with a bunch of different bloggers. And one of the things that we saw were people shooting off their airplanes off the deck, night landings, which is one of the most terrifying, scary things you could ever imagine. Imagine a tiny little blob on a moonless night, and you've got to find it in the midst of the ocean and land your plane on that without any visual guidance whatsoever. And then this is the captain. He's the captain of the entire ship, 5,000 people, typically between the ages of 18 and 22. If you have anybody in that age, you know what kind of a management challenge that is. And he runs a really, really tight ship. Really tight ship. Everybody knows exactly what they're going to do. And when they do it, they drill, 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 drill. And so in the midst of this, they threw 16 bloggers. And we had access to the entire ship for 24 hours. Now, I asked you before, how many of you would feel comfortable with writing that sort of transparent post? How many of you would feel comfortable allowing 16 bloggers into your organization for 24 hours, unfettered access to write and take pictures of anything? Okay, that's terrifying, really. So we did a lot of that. We took big pictures and we interviewed people, and we were constantly sticking our noses into different crevices of the ship. And what was interesting to us was how open this organization was. And they just opened the doors. They had nothing that they wanted to hide. We asked really tough questions. I, for one, was really kind of skeptical about the whole thing and came away with a tremendous, tremendous understanding and appreciation for what our military and service people do. So it was a fantastic experience. And what was interesting to me is that they had the confidence in themselves to be open. And the question has always been, especially with these kinds of relationships, how open will you be? And here's an example of how open you could be. This is Luis Delgado. He's one of the top guns, those people who fly those pilots. And believe me, they are just like Tom Cruise. They are strutting, they're like trash talking each other, and yet they turn around and they say things like this. Landing at night, it just fills you with terror. Every flight is almost as if you die a little death. That level of authenticity, that level of confidence, they have to be able to trust each other. They have to be able to trust their entire shipmates, that they will bring them home, especially in those night landings, home safely. They can't do it themselves. So when you think about that kind of organization, one that is highly structured, but also very open in the communications, in the relationship, it's a very interesting combination. And the way I think about it is, how do you be in control when you're not? And this is a fallacy. One of the biggest issues when you're a leader, you feel like you have to be in control, but it's really a different thing. I think a really effective leader in this day and age is one who is able to give up the need to be in control, but at the same time, he can still be in command. The captain of that ship didn't control every single thing, but it was very clear he was in command. But he had the confidence in his entire team that they would be able to rise up to the occasion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, just very briefly, because of the definition of what I think open leadership means. It means having the confidence, but also, very importantly, the humility to admit that you are not in control and that it's okay, and actually it's to your advantage, because your type of leadership now is going to come from inspiration and going to inspire people to make the commitment to follow you and to accomplish the goals that you have set. So in this day and age, who's a leader? How many of you have Twitter accounts? Okay, quite a few of you do. That's great. You have followers. Probably people on your team, your staff members, have followers too. They are leaders. A leader is simply defined by just having followers. So think about who can actually be a leader, and the definition of leadership radically changes. It's no longer a title. It's no longer the people or the budgets that you control. It's whoever follows you and is inspired by you to achieve those goals. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be an open leader. There are two key things I talked about before: authenticity and transparency. So what does that actually look like? What is it defined by? And I believe that we can always feel like we're being authentic, it's being me, I'm real at being out there. But authenticity and transparency doesn't start with you. It's actually how people perceive you. Do they perceive you as being authentic? Do they see you as being transparent enough that they would be inspired by you to follow you? So it's really about that relationship again between you and your followers. Do they perceive you and believe that you are authentic and transparent? And I'll give you an example of this. So let's think about what it means to practice everyday transparency. Some of you may have seen this a couple of years ago. It was a video of a FedEx driver tossing a computer monitor over a security gate. Obviously, the person was in a bit of a hurry. And you can see that 8.5 million people had seen that video. Again, kind of another crisis kind of situation. Now, what do you do as FedEx? Well, they had learned from people like Dell, and they immediately made a video. Of course, video to respond to a video. And it's this person, he goes out there and responds, and it was textbook. It was fast, it was less than 48 hours, textbook response. But it was very clear that this is the very first time he had done this. It was very clear that it was the first time that FedEx had ever done this kind of big public apology in response to a very viral video. They hadn't done this in previous times. They've used social media and other channels to sometimes respond to people, but that relationship wasn't there. So in the midst of a crisis, they couldn't pull on those relationships, couldn't pull on those trusted people in their networks to be able to help bring that message out and bring that relationship forward. Were they being authentic and transparent here? Absolutely. But it wasn't being perceived that way. So I think the call for here today is, how do you prepare for having that different type of relationship, not just for crises, but to be able to move forward the very big and tough agendas that you have on your dockets. So I think the key here is to build that trust with everyday transparency. So I am going to talk about a little bit about strategy, and I'm going to give you a couple takeaways about how you can begin thinking about being an open leader. And then we'll have hopefully some time for a few questions. So I went back to this over here, this model, and one of the key things I want to talk about is the guidelines and the strategies you have to put in place. One of the first things is think about what are your key strategic goals for your organization. What are you trying to accomplish today, this year, and next year? And then pick the ones, very specific ones that can have, where social and technologies can have a really important impact. The last thing you want to do is just to try these technologies just to see what happens. Think about instead what you can accomplish with them, and very specifically go full force into that. Double down on those areas. Don't hold back. Because unless you really give it a try, you'll never see the full effect. You can't do relationships as sort of halfway. Your constituents won't say, like, are you serious about this relationship or are you not? So if it's going to be important, find the ones and double down on those. And one of the key questions I get asked all the time is, how do I measure the impact? And I love this quote from the CMO of American Express. And he says, we tend to overvalue the things we can measure and to undervalue the things that we cannot. And relationships are notoriously difficult to measure. How do you measure the impact of being here together? taking the time to figure out all this and come together and the new connections you make. Anybody measuring the ROI of today? Going back and report on that? Some of you may be, but that's very difficult. So when you're investing in these relationships now through these technologies, really think about how they add value back to those goals. And in many ways, it may be anecdotal, but the value you have to recognize and be able to express right from the very beginning. Let's talk about discipline. I'm all about process. This is about not just putting something out there and seeing what happens, but building a triage chart. Now, this is from H&R Block, and this is their triage chart of what happens when they use their listening platforms to find mentions and conversations in social about them. They go and listen, and they find out if somebody's happy, if they're sad, if they're mad. You can see that's one guy in red. He's not very happy. Well, what happens then? They go and triage that, they assess it. Is this something you can respond to? They then engage, decide to engage or not to engage, and then they close the loop. They listen again to see, did it have the intended impact we wanted? Now, I show this chart in almost every single one of my presentations. And how many of you have a triage chart that looks even remotely something like this? Okay, a couple hands. I saw 3 hands go up. So that's pretty good, actually. Almost usually no hands go up. So you're beating most of the audiences that I see already. That kind of discipline, though, is really important because you probably have this when people call your office, when people email, but not when they're using their channel of choice now, which are these new social channels and these new digital channels. So if these relationships are important to you, and I hope they are, you'll be there listening for that, and then have a process beyond just the ad hoc mentions and the processes that are there to make sure that those mentions and those relationships have meaning. As part of that, I encourage you to think about how you want to train your staff and the volunteers that are working with you. And in particular, when it comes to social media, it's so easy to say what you should do. Do these things, engage, be open and transparent, share information. There's a whole bunch of other information that you just shouldn't do. Don't pretend to be somebody else, things like that. Those are kind of obvious. But in the middle is a tremendous amount of gray. And that gray is notoriously difficult to define because it's constantly changing and requires judgment. So how do you train for judgment? It's the hardest thing because, frankly, judgment is learned from making mistakes. So how tolerant will you be of making mistakes, people learning on the job, literally in public, and being able to do this on a continual basis. So really think about what kind of training you want to provide people, what kind of support and background and education, because you're going to have to need it. People, even if they're young, in their 20s, don't intuitively know how to use these tools to engage on your behalf, to engage with constituents. Let's talk about what you need to do as a leader. I do think that the foundation for a relationship is around sharing, and you need to create a culture of sharing. Traditionally, organizations do this instead. Don't share anything. Don't tell anyone anything. Keep it private, or check with all these different people before you put something out there. But in this day and age, I think you want to be opening up more and more categories to be able to understand what you can share. And one of the questions I get often asked is, what can we share? What should we talk about? Well, imagine if somebody was standing right next to you. I had the honor today of meeting Kevin and Warren for the first time, but I've been listening to you guys forever, it feels like. So what would I say to them? What would they say to me if they were standing right next to me? And they have fantastic interactions online because they really treat people as if they were standing right next to them. What would they say? It really feels like it's them when they're talking. So think about what you would share through these new channels as if you were able to talk to people at scale if they were standing next to you. Just 2 more tips. My second to last one is really about mastering the art of failure. How many are really good at failing? I mean, really practice it a lot and fail all the time. But this is the only way we grow, right? And I said before, no relationships are perfect. So how will you deal with the inevitable failures that come from these relationships that you're forming? It will happen. You can't make it not go away. That risk is always going to be there. And yet we are so fearful of engaging in these relationships because of what would happen. It's like dating the first time. Remember those days? What happens if that person says no if I ask? What happens? It's going to be so embarrassing. It's not the end of the world, but you can move on from that. So really think about this. And I do love the Google mantra of fail fast, fail smart. The idea that if you're going to fail, Set it up so that you can learn from it, anticipate that the failure is going to happen, and then be able to actually praise people for failing because they took that chance and went out there and did this, and we all learn from that as an organization. And my last point is going back to you. You personally, what is your social strategy going to be? Because you are all leaders, people are looking at you and saying, well, what is that person doing and saying? And I saw quite a few hands go up on Twitter. But how do you mix, in particular, your personal, your professional? How do I make that whole thing come together? Who is the me that's going to be out there that multiple audiences are going to see? And I thought I'd give you an example of Padmasree Warrior. Now, she is the CTO and the CSO for Cisco. So she is very, very powerful in tech circles and also very influential. She has almost 1.5 million people following her on Twitter. And she just began just sort of tweeting, experimenting with it a couple of years ago, and has really expanded into this wonderful persona. Now, there's two sides of Padmasree that you see. There's obviously the professional side, and she's talking about strategy, for example. She just puts out little missives like, the hardest part of strategy is figuring out the so what. But then she turns around and also does this. She shares her personal passions. She was recently in Chicago, and she posted up a picture, and she writes haiku, which is perfect for Twitter. She writes, rustling in the dark, muffled voices from afar, listen, it's the wind. And it's a homage to Windy City. She puts up a picture. Another part here, she paints. And so she's sharing a picture, sketching of a picture that she put up, stage one of a painting, sketching what's in my head of bucket boys, guys just banging on buckets on the street. So why is she doing this? Why would she share two of her passions, poetry and painting, when she's obviously talking about tech too as well? But she realizes that this is not just about people following her. They also want to know who she is as a person. But she's not being authentic and transparent about everything in her life. She has a family. She has all these personal things, personal friends. She's not going to share those things. But she has chosen to share two things that she's passionate about so that people can learn more about her. And for you, especially here in this local environment, what do we do when we see each other? We talk about our personal things. We talk about that personal connection, our kids, the schools, the places that we live. And so we have to feel comfortable talking about that personal side and mixing it with the professional side. And every single person in here is going to approach that in a very different way. So I ask you, what is your personal strategy going to be? How are you going to develop these relationships? And I'll give you a quick tidbit. When I saw Padmasree recently at a dinner party at her house for women leaders in tech. And I was walking up the driveway, and one woman was walking in. I said, oh, you're obviously going to the same dinner. She goes, yes, I'm a friend of Padmasree's from Twitter. I met her on Twitter. And I go, oh, so you guys know each other? She goes, oh, no, actually, this is my very first time meeting her. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. So we walk up, and she comes in, and the two of them obviously recognize each other, and they run at each other, give each other big, huge bear hugs. And they just continue the conversations that they had obviously been having on Twitter. So this is a very real relationship for her. And she's obviously in tech, not a lightweight. But if she can form those kinds of deep relationships where you feel like you understand and know people, think about the opportunity for you to be able to understand and hear from people that you work with and serve on a continual basis, and the kinds of relationships you can form. Incredibly, incredibly powerful. So if you take nothing else from today, it is this, that social is about relationships. It's about the ones you can create, the ones you can deepen. It is not about technologies. You'll see so many cool technologies and hear about them today, but I urge you to think about what kind of relationships you can form, the ones that you want to form, and to challenge yourself in an organization to do that. This is my contact information. I'm happy to share the slides, the reports, and information. Just send me an email. And I think we have time for like maybe one or two questions. Any questions at all? Yeah, go ahead.
Particularly in, when we're talking about local government, let's say, getting involved in this, it really starts to transcend boundaries, and you start seeing interactions not just of residents, but of people from across the country who often have very polarized views. I think one of the fears, I know for at least one local government, there's a, oh, sorry.
So I guess the concern with
particularly in the local government context, is that you're opening the door to an audience that may or may not be actually within your community, yet they also have very, energetic and polarized positions that may drive the conversation in a way that, can actually be somewhat corrosive. How do you manage that?
I think, again, it's choosing. Again, the strategy is choosing what you will do and what you won't do. And choosing to, if you can, the hard part is figuring out who's a constituent and who isn't. And you can ask, if people are lying, there's not much you can do about it. But over time, you do tend to figure out who are the locals and who are not, who are really the ones you want to develop a relationship with. And you tell the other people, thank you for joining the conversation. We're not having that conversation. I kind of think of them as trolls. I mean, the people who have been in the tech space, you all have trolls. I have trolls who follow me all the time. And I always have this adage, never feed the trolls. Because the more you feed them, the more they come back. And you get your other constituents who also say, you don't want to have that conversation. Now, if they're fanning the flames, and there were other things that you would do, again, if they were to come physically into the community. But the same thing, if somebody were to come through those doors right now and cause disruption, we'd ask that person to leave. And so there's no reason. I mean, this is a place where a community that you're trying to have, and you say, you're not welcome here. Now, if they're fanning the flames of people already, that's a little bit harder. But the more you engage, you have to choose which ones you will engage in. But you do have a lot of choice on that. Don't feed the trolls. Time for one more question? Okay.
Hi, just wondering if you have any ideas. I come from a small community that is very rural, between all Silicon Valley and everything. We're down on the South Coast. And even though we have been trying to create these relationships within the school district with parents, it's easy to create them with the students who are on Facebook and all that. But the parents, they don't even receive it. I mean, these things have a high cost sometimes. So how can then you really try to create those relationships when the technology, the cost is a limitation, and also the access?
Yeah, I go back to the lowest common denominator. I saw on here the emergency alert for San Mateo County, which I absolutely love and adore. And one of the things is email is the most common denominator for this. So almost every household has it. I mean, you have people who are not on the internet. You can't address that. You have to address that in different ways. But I do find the power of email to be tremendous. The problem with email is that it's not interactive back and forth. But for the people who are able to engage, who are interested in engaging, you want to make it as interesting and also compelling as possible. And it oftentimes about how do you spur that engagement, right? Go back to what's most important to them. Not to you, but to them. And this kind of goes on that edge. It may be those topics that you don't want to talk about. I mean, schools engaging with parents is one of the most terrifying things. The last thing you want to do is ask parents for opinions, because then the school feels obligated to have to honor and do what the parents say. But that's opening a new door for a relationship, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't say, let's engage, but I'm not going to listen to you. Doesn't make any sense. So you have to give people the sense that they will listen to you and that it is going to have an impact. If they're going to take time away from their very busy day to engage in this new channel, what are they going to get out of it? Not about you, it's about them. So what will they get out of it? The smaller communities, I think, even have greater opportunities because you can take those interactions that are very hard to organize because you're dependent on a much smaller base. And the asynchronous nature of these technologies allow people to engage with each other on their own time schedules. So I've yet to meet a community that wasn't passionate about something. It could be the opening of a Safeway store. It could be the opening and closing of another store, investments in the new infrastructure, the fall fair. It could be any of those things. Recently, there was a beer and bacon, I think, thing going on in San Mateo Park. I think quite a few of us went to that. That was huge on social media. That's what people were passionate about, but that's where you begin. Okay. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you through these channels. Thank you.
Charlene Lee, everyone. I definitely need a personal triage chart after that presentation. I love it. You're brilliant, Charlene. Thank you so much.